Hello, and welcome to Everything is Spooky in the Dark, the podcast for WanderingCrystal.com. I'm your host, Crystal, and today we'll be talking about the plague village, Eyam. It's the year 1665. Eyam, a tiny village in Derbyshire County in England, was home to about 400 people. In a time when medicine was nothing more than simple sweet-smelling herbs, and of doctors who took sips of patients' urine to figure out what illness they had. The thought of a disease that killed so many, so quickly, in a world that had no medical defense, was terrifying. It's August 31st in Eyam, and everything was about to change by the arrival of an unsuspecting piece of cloth. The summer heat penetrated the air as George Vicker, a tailor's assistant, opened a bundle of fabric that had just arrived from London. However, back in London, the Black Death had a hold and was ravaging the city, infecting and killing thousands of people. Unfortunately, the cloth that had arrived in Eyam was holding the disease-ridden fleas that carried the plague. George Vickers hung the newly received cloth to dry, thus shaking out the plague-infested fleas that came along for the ride. Just 7 days later, George was the first victim of the plague in Eyam. He died in horrendous agony on the 7th of September. The Black Death was dreadful. Also known as the bubonic plague, symptoms include a fever, headache, chills, weakness, and swollen, painful lymph nodes. The worst part? The lymph nodes would burst open, turning into red sores and wounds, which would allow bacteria to enter the body and become septicemic, allowing the plague to enter the bloodstream, which would kill the victim quickly. The pestilence swept through the village rapidly. The heat of the summer helped spread the disease faster, killing 42 villagers in a number of months. Villagers wanted to run off, to distance themselves from the destruction and death that was eating its way through Eyam. It was then that William Mompesson, the village's rector, decided that Eyam needed to prevent spreading the plague to nearby villages through quarantine. No one would be allowed in or out of Eyam until the spread of the plague ended. The villagers were reluctant at first, but eventually agreed, ultimately entering into a death pact. Eyam sacrificed itself to eliminate the spread of the plague to nearby places, saving thousands of lives while ending their own. The Black Death went from house to house, wiping out entire families, leaving some to survive, only to bury their loved ones who perished. Those that remained would be isolated with nothing more than their grief, carrying the pain as they witnessed other families follow suit throughout their tiny village. The plague was harsh. Eyam resident Elizabeth Hancock lost her husband and 6 of her children to the plague over the course of only 8 days. Elizabeth wrapped her children in thin sheets of fabric, tying them up tight before dragging their bodies out, one by one, to bury them on a hill that is now known as the Riley Graves. People in Eyam had to bury their dead alone so they could prevent the plague from infecting others. People from nearby villages could see Elizabeth burying her family from a nearby hill, unable and too scared to help. Nearby villages did help Eyam during their quarantine by bringing food, drink, and medicines to the boundary stone and a nearby well. The rector, William Mompesson, would leave coins soaking in a bowl of vinegar as payment. The vinegar would act as a disinfectant in an attempt to prevent the spread of the disease through the coins. For 14 long months, Eyam remained shut. Villager after villager and family after family died from the plague until November 1st, 1666, when the last victim, Abraham Morton, died. In the end, Eyam, the village that sacrificed itself, lost over half of its residents. A total of 260 people of the original 400 died. Today, Eyam is known as the Plague Village and opens its doors in history to all who visit. As you walk through Eyam, you'll be able to visit many of the historic buildings that were around during the plague outbreak in 1665. The plague cottage still stands. This is the building where the plague began. Mary Hadfield lived there with her husband, 2 sons, and George Vickers. Mary survived but lost a total of 13 relatives during the 14 months as the plague swept through Eyam, leaving no one untouched. As you continue walking through Eyam, you will pass plaques that commemorate the families and their history, of who died and who survived the Black Death. The Hawksford family, Rose Cottage, home of the Thorpe family, and Marshall Howe's house. Marshall Howe's life was filled with sadness. Although he did survive the plague and figured he wouldn't become infected again, he took up the position of the village sexton, otherwise known as a gravedigger. He helped bury those who passed so that others wouldn't have to do it alone. But ultimately, he was left alone to bury his own family after his wife and child had contracted the plague and died. As you continue along, you'll pass the graves that are scattered throughout the village. Just past the church on top of the hill is Mompesson's Well, which was one of the sites where outsiders would leave the food and medicine to ensure that Eyam would have a fighting chance at surviving. The last stop, which will leave gut-wrenching feelings of sadness, is the Riley Graves. Just past down Riley Lane, the Riley Graves is where Elizabeth Hancock's family resides. Eyam was an incredibly unselfish village, where an entire group sealed their fate of sadness and death so that others could survive. And with that, the people of Eyam should be remembered and honored for their sacrifice that saved so many others. And that's it. Thank you so much for listening to Everything is Spooky in the Dark. If you want more information on Eyam and other sites around the world with dark history, visit wanderingcrystal.com. Thanks.